Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Ambassador Luis C.deBaca. He's an American lawyer and diplomat who served in the Obama administration as Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. He is at Yale as the Robina Fellow in Modern Slavery at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the study of slavery, resistance, and abolition at the MacMillan Center. As one of the United States' most decorated federal prosecutors, Ambassador C.deBaca investigated and prosecuted crimes of human trafficking, immigration, hate crimes, money laundering, and official misconduct. He updated the post-Civil War statutes and the 13th Amendment to develop the victim-centered approach to modern slavery, which has become the global standard for combating human trafficking through the Trafficking in Persons Protocol to the United Nations Organized Crime Convention. Today we'll talk with Ambassador C.deBaca about the work that the Gilder Lehrman Center is doing on modern-day slavery and his work on transparency in supply chains and enforcement. Welcome, Ambassador.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with your work here as a Robina Fellow. Tell us about what you're doing.
Well, I've been taking advantage of a lot of the things that Yale has to offer, especially the archives. There's some wonderful archival resources as far as cases that were done 100 years ago during the Roosevelt administration, Taft administration, even then up into kind of the lead into the World War II under Roosevelt. And so looking at those and seeing kind of what, in effect, my predecessors in the Civil Rights Division at its beginnings were doing to go out and investigate and prosecute those who would still hold someone in slavery 85, 90 years after the Civil War.
Okay, and the GLC, the Gilder Lehrman Center, is kind of, I won't say moving away, but incorporating more research and work on modern day trafficking, modern slavery, kind of moving not away towards the antebellum slavery, but incorporating more of the modern day trafficking that's going on throughout the world. So what kinds of things are they incorporating?
Well, one of the things, obviously I'm looking at modern slavery as well as kind of trying to bridge the gap between the Civil War and pre-Civil War chattel slavery, the organized legal structure that was both political and social in the United States. That changes in 1865, but one of the brilliant things about the 13th Amendment is it doesn't just say it's over as of today, it actually says, and it never will be replicated. So it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist. And that second part is really what I've worked on in government, and it's one of the things that fuels the GLC's work as far as modern slavery. How is it that the framers of the 13th Amendment, the abolitionists, that the GLC has been renowned for studying, for having such insights that David Bryan Davis and others, certainly David Blight, now the director, have been able to bring to those actors? But then what are the parallels that we see in the modern era? What are the fissures between the different parts of the modern abolitionist movement? Some people want to deal mainly with sex trafficking of US citizen children. Other people want to see the issue as through a gender lens as far as migrant women and states kind of, how do they regulate that migration? Others want to look at it through a prostitution lens, and still others want to look at it as an opportunity to fight for labor rights for all people in America and overseas. All of those things together are very redolent of the wonderful, terrible squabbling of the abolitionist movement, even to the point of when you look at the slave narratives, whether it's Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs, writing about their experiences. And if you kind of overlay them with what people are saying now in the last 20 years, when they're coming out of, say for instance, a brothel in a immigrant serving community, or a house where they've been held as a domestic servant, the ways that people unfamiliar with the slave narratives of 150 years ago describe their own lived experience is so redolent of what escaped slaves would say about what was happening to them.
It's like a universal thing.
Exactly, and I think that the GLC is in a particularly good position to be able to make that leap. You know, it's not just the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, it's slavery resistance and abolition.
Right.
And that notion of the ongoing resistance, what does the 13th Amendment mean in an era where we don't have legal, formal systems of slavery? One of the things that the GLC recently did was to have a conference where we were able to bring in people from around the world, scholars mainly, but some practitioners, to really kick the tires on this. What is working? It's been almost 20 years since the United Nations Protocol, since the American Trafficking Victims Protection Act updated those post-Civil War statutes. And 18 years on, where are we? What's working, what's not working?
Right. I will like to get into that at some point to see what your ideas on, you know, what can be done. But I am curious to know, and I think many people aren't really in tune to the fact that it is such a huge global problem. Can you put it in perspective with some numbers, perhaps?
Of course. The estimates that are out there tend to range a bit, but I tend to look at the kind of 24 to 27 million as the figure that I would take to the bank. There's a figure that goes up to about 40 million. That involves the recent addition by some researchers and the ILO, the International Labor Organization, on trying to capture the related issue of child marriage and forced marriage.
Right.
If you back those forced marriage numbers out, the numbers seem to be around 25 to 27 million, which if you compare that to antebellum slavery, not just in the United States, but in the entire hemisphere, you're talking about maybe 4 million folks who were brought from Africa during the slave trade, whether to Brazil, whether to the United States, what's now the United States, the Caribbean Basin, et cetera. So the numbers are greater, but of course there's a lot more people in the world.
Right.
I think one of the things that's different now, though, is that entire societies are not based on this. Everywhere in the world, pretty much, everywhere in the world, slavery is illegal now. That wasn't the case in the Gulf states. It wasn't the case in Saudi Arabia within living memory. And so those countries or places like Mauritania and Mali who are just now making it illegal, the age-old practices of hereditary slavery, they're at a very different place than most other countries.
Right.
But what most countries are having to do is 100 or 150 years after they abolished legal slavery, they're having to confront its presence in their society. So there's that moment, I think, for policymakers around the world where everybody says, oh my God, it's happening again.
Right.
Or maybe it never stopped happening, we
Right.
just stopped looking for it.
And that's, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because I mean, though that's 25 million, that's a huge number all around the world, and even in the United States, it's happening, and people say, how can that possibly be happening in this country? So shed some light on that. How is it happening in the United States?
Well, it happens even in countries like the United States where there is rule of law and where corruption is not the norm, and where the economy no longer depends on it, like the southern agricultural economy depended on it up until about the 1940s. That's not the case anymore. But the reason why I think there's these echoes of slavery, and you see people who are being subjected to practices that directly violate the 13th Amendment, even today, is if you have a combination of vulnerable people and greed and cruelty, that's kind of the recipe for this witch's brew of enslavement. It could be a family that brings a young girl over from West Africa with promises of a better life and going to school in America. Suddenly that 13-year-old is walking the other children to the school bus and turning around and going back and working in their home as a maid. The knock on the door at night from the man of the house or the older sons, I think tells us that sometimes our ideas that sex trafficking and labor trafficking are totally separate maybe doesn't necessarily line up with the lived experiences of a lot of women and girls who find themselves into this situation.
Right.
But it can also be something that's much more open if we would only see it while we drive by it. So if you're in the fields in central Florida, if you're going through the pine forests where people are doing the reforestation, and actually ask the workers, you know, do you have a debt? Are you paying off that classic old company store debt? By the end of the week, you owe more than you ever would have been able to pay.
Right, right.
And the folks over at the law school did a case with the pine workers a few years ago where, under the guise of environmentalism, the big forestry companies were going out and having people plant new trees, but those men were enslaved. So I think that we have to look at some of our baseline assumptions, whether it's around sustainability, whether it's around environmentalism, whether it's about kind of where we are in the world, and then start with the first question, which is, are the people who are doing it slave or free?
Mm-hmm. And what led you to this line of work?
Well, I went to the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department fresh out of law school.
Mm-hmm.
I worked in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, which is where the prosecutors are. And the three main things that you do in the criminal section civil rights are all flowing from the constitutional rights, typically from the post-Civil War constitutional amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so we look at police misconduct. So in other words, police brutality, really. Misconduct is just a euphemism.
Right.
So police brutality, racial violence, which now has thankfully expanded to look at hate crimes and bias crimes motivated by gender, sexual orientation, religion, et cetera, not just race. And then, of course, involuntary servitude and slavery. And at different times over the last 100 years, each of those areas have taken the bulk of the section's work. In the 1950s and 60s, it was very much, in the Mississippi burning years, it was very much about trying to take down the Klan and the entire system of lynching and violence in the South. In the 80s and 90s, I think there was probably more attention to police brutality in many ways. Human trafficking, which is the new kind of international term, kind of takes us back to the work of the 30s and 40s, the anti-peonage years. But now what we really see is my former colleagues are having to deal with all of them simultaneously, because in a globalized world, slavery is back. As we are able to see more of what police are doing in their encounters with civilians, we are recognizing that there's a lot more police brutality out there than people knew. And the specter of racial violence never goes away. So I was in that section. It's about 30 people, and you get to be the guy from Washington who comes out to local places and tells them what to do, which makes you very popular in a lot of places around the world. But what it does is it really puts you on the forefront of these promises that were made in 1865 and thereafter, as far as the federal government's necessity to go out and insist that these constitutional protections apply to vulnerable communities. And so that's kind of how I ended up doing this. I specialized, I think, more because there weren't that many Spanish-speaking attorneys. As you got more people from the Asian and Latino communities coming into the government in the 90s in roles like this, I think a lot of us came in and we looked at things with a fresh and new lens, saying, this is happening in our communities because we know it from talking to our cousins and just knowing our own history. And so there was kind of an insistence, I think, on the part of a lot of the Latino and especially Asian and South Asian lawyers that this is something that we wanted to work on, as well as working on, quote unquote, traditional civil rights.
And do you think the problem of human trafficking and slavery is on the rise, or do you think it's being held at bay?
It's hard for me to tell. I mean, I think that one of the things that we're seeing is that there's no good numbers. The prevalence numbers are, people are working very hard to try to get this. Good social scientists, many of whom are now finally starting to look not at things that are biased by enforcement numbers. Enforcement numbers could be totally skewed simply by what the priorities of that local law enforcement office is. If they have somebody that speaks Spanish, then their numbers will end up having a bunch of cases that have Spanish-speaking victims. And if they don't, they may never actually identify those cases. So there's some new prevalence work that's being done by sociologists and anthropologists around the world that are trying to use some of the predictive things that are coming out of the war crimes and genocide space. And that's really interesting. We haven't really started to kind of bridge the gaps from Gilder Lehrman Center, which has up till now been, I think, much more of kind of a history center. It's very much the mission.
Right.
But at the same time, I think we're starting to see now, with some of the different fellows that have come through the GLC recently, and with some of the work that we're hoping to do in the coming years, very much bridging the gap over to the sociologists, the anthropologists, the business school, I guess here it's the School of Management, as well as even the folks from the public health over at the medical school.
Right.
I think there's a lot of ways that we can start to put together that knowledge base so that we can answer that question in the future.
A much more interdisciplinary kind of approach to solve the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But prevalence aside, one of the things that Bill Gates famously said to a couple of other donors in the anti-trafficking space that he'd take a pass on doing work in this and work on malaria and other things because he didn't feel like this was countable yet. And of course, that's the problem. It's a hidden crime. People suffering in silence that don't come forward. And unlike domestic violence or sexual violence, we haven't necessarily come up with the proxies yet so that we can come up with a number to answer people like Gates and others to say, yes, we can measure this, and therefore we can see whether it's up, down, sideways, and whether any particular intervention really is making a difference across the board. What we do know, though, is that the individual intervention that you make, when somebody goes out through a window and seeks help, if you have the policies in place so that they aren't going from the firing pan into the fire, so that they're incorporated into government protections, into non-governmental organizations, service providers, even though that's a one-off, it's not a systemic fix. To me, there is that kind of saying that everybody has as far as in each individual life is the universe. And I think it's the same thing that, if we can do right by one trafficking victim at a time, eventually we can have that universe of freedom.
Right, right. I am wanting to talk about the term victim-centered approach to modern slavery and how it's different from what was previously done. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, typically in most legal systems, including the United States, a person who suffers a crime is a witness. They're often called a complaining witness. So you talk about your CW in law enforcement slang. As opposed to this idea that they're a person who had been victimized by what happened to them. They were valuable more for for what they could tell you about the crime as opposed to that something had happened to them. The Civil Rights Division prosecutors, I think, came from a little bit of a different place because we were having to vindicate the rights that had been violated. It wasn't that the interest of the United States in not having houses burned down was being violated when somebody would do a racially motivated arson. It was that family's interest under the First Amendment and 14th Amendment in being able to live in an integrated neighborhood without being subjected to violence. And so I think our set point, without knowing it, this was kind of, it's like asking a fish about the water, right? Our set point was very much, we start with this person's rights were violated. And I think that out of that flowed the victim-centered approach, which was, we are here for what's best for them. If it's a child victim and they might not be able to testify because of trauma, we either come up with another way to prosecute the case or we charge something that's not really going to require that child to have to testify. We have to bend to allow, when I say we, I mean law enforcement, has to bend to allow non-governmental organizations and advocacy groups, the church, others, to come into the case and have a level of power that you never would allow in an organized crime case or a money laundering case or something like that. And so a lot of the victim-centered approach is kind of resetting the criminal justice response. So you really are putting the victim and their needs at the center. It's not that you're providing them housing and psychological services simply to get them to be a better witness for you. It's you're providing them housing and psychological services because when you're trying to put together somebody's life after their rights have been violated, and you as the state are the guarantor of those rights, then it flows from that you should do those things to make them whole, or even better than they were before the trafficker got them. So I think that a lot of the victim-centered approach is simply, where you stand and look. And if you stand with the victims and listen to them, I think you end up having that instrumentality of a better case, yes, but more importantly, the entire ethos of the work that you're doing changes.
Right, and that makes sense. And I'm wondering how well that's been accepted in this country.
It has in fits and starts, obviously. Just a few weeks ago, we saw the commutation of sentence of a young woman who had been in Kentucky, I think, had been in prison for 15 years after killing a client. She was an underage girl who was in prostitution, therefore under the American law and the UN was automatically considered a trafficking victim. You don't have to show that somebody's will is overborne if they're under 18, because just like with statutory rape, there's this idea that somebody that age can't consent to be involved in commercial sex. And so go back, a couple of decades, and here's this 15-year-old girl who ends up killing one of the men who's raping her. Let's not use euphemisms as to what the clients of underage people in prostitution are doing. And I think that we saw just, whether it was online or otherwise, in much of December and early January of this year, a real outpouring from people saying, no, she should not be in jail for what she did. So I think that it's getting out there in the culture. I think that ethos is happening. People are not just being seen as, oh, that's an illegal alien or that's a prostitute. One of the things that we heard at the GLC's Modern Slavery Conference in November was just how, for most of the 20th century, even the FBI, who was supposed to be investigating these cases, would look at a case and say, oh, well, she's got a bad reputation in the community, so we're not going to bring the case. And it's like, well, of course she has a bad reputation in the community. Her pimp was putting her out on the street through force, threats of force, or because she was underage. In fact, that's the case that law enforcement should be running towards rather than running away from. I think that cultural shift is happening, but we have to keep the hammer down.
Right. So how do we shine the light on those shadows on modern slavery? What are some things that need to happen?
Well, I think
to turn the culture and make a difference.
I think one of the things is to look at kind of what has worked in the past. One of the most effective things in the British Empire, as far as abolition was concerned, were the boycotts of sugar from the West Indies. And so you had consumer activism at a time when people didn't even have labels like consumer in the early 1800s, where people were actively shunning West Indian sugar. Now, that created a market for colonial sugar that was coming from East India, and which, displacement effect, there was a lot of other abuses and things from that. But as far as what it did with that particular slavery in the Caribbean, is that it really started the moving towards the end game. When you had British consumers who were making their decisions with their pocketbooks, it got the attention of not only the sugar growers, but it certainly got the attention of their bankers. That's a lot of what we're trying to do right now in the anti-slavery movement in modern times, but not just in one sector. So it's like do that, but then do it in fish, in palm oil, in garment, in labor, construction, electronics, you name it. So what we've been able to do, not just in the United States, a law that California passed a few years ago, but also in the United Kingdom, and just recently in Australia, a law, both the British and Australian laws, I was able to work with some of the parliamentarians as we were coming up with it. But that basically requires companies to file publicly what they're doing to trace and ameliorate abuses within their supply chains. Now, what I hope it also does is it provides fodder for academics and others to go and maybe even lawyers to go look at the company's disclosures and find out whether they're actually doing those things. What is it that a Fortune 500 company publicly says that it's doing versus what we know when we go out and talk to the workers? Start to kick the tires on that. But up until now, there hasn't been anything to compare against. So the Modern Slavery Act in both Britain and now Australia, I think are revolutionary when it really comes down to it.
So what other things because you're working with supply chains, and it intrigues me where I can see boycotting certain products certainly would work, but it's hard because we don't really know what to boycott. I mean, I think it would work better on the flip side if someone is going and looking at companies and actually seeing who the workers are, but then I guess there's not enough manpower or resources to keep track of that. So what exactly are you advocating?
Well, I think that one of the things that we see is that because there are so many things that are tainted by slavery, if we want to live, eat, clothe ourselves, all of those things in the modern globalized economy, then the reality is that we will end up having something to do with slavery ourselves, every one of us. One of the things that hopefully the students in my class, my first class meets tomorrow, and so their read-ahead exercise is actually to go online and take their slavery footprint, which is a great little website, slaveryfootprint.org, where you can go on and take about a 10-minute survey of what you own, what you consume, what's in your medicine chest, all those types of things. And it will tell you, based on some algorithmic work that UC Berkeley did for them, it will tell you roughly how many people in forced labor around the world it takes to sustain your lifestyle. So I'm really interested in having Yale undergrads have to confront their own, I don't want to say culpability, because if all of us are culpable, then it's a systemic issue that we have to look at. But you can't solve it by yourself by suddenly saying, well, I'm only going to wear tunics that I've knitted by hand from the 2 sheep that I own.
Right.
I mean, even that probably would have something. So I think that one of the things that we're looking to harness is that interest that then goes up to whether it's governments or whether it's businesses to be the ones that do it. They know their supply chain better than we do. And one of my lasting memories in Thailand in the fisheries was that they kept saying, well, we can't tell you which boat the shrimp came from because that's just tracing the supply chain way down, way too far down. And so a couple of people from my office, from the State Department, were out at one of the shrimp packing sheds. And first, the workers always said, well, we don't like it when you come because the bosses always warn us the day before that you're coming, and so then we don't bring our children, and we have to get childcare. I don't think that that was what the bosses wanted the workers to say to the American diplomats, but
But that is the reality.
But that is the reality. But the second thing is that one of my staff noticed that there were barcoding on the trays, the big plastic tubs of shrimp, and they were hitting it with the barcoding machine. And she asked, what's going on? They're like, oh, we have to do that because the American Food and Drug Association, or Food and Drug Administration, requires us to be able to know where the shrimp came from in case there's a health outbreak. These are the same companies in a country where the government and the companies had been telling us, oh, we can't trace this back to the actual boat. It's like they didn't want to trace it back to the actual boat for this purpose. The question that raises to me, though, is why doesn't if the United States Food and Drug Administration has the power to look at that, then why doesn't the Customs and Border Protection have the power to do that so that we don't bring in slave-made goods? And so as a result, President Obama issued an executive order doing just that. And we were able to get, with Senator Ron Wyden and others, a change to the Tariff Act that made it clear that you couldn't import slave-made goods. And so now, tracing down to the boat, tracing down to the farm, and actually requiring that they look at their supply chain if they expect to bring things in the United States, that's becoming a reality. And we were very happy to see actually that one of the people from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, one of the folks who's setting up that office and is going to be doing the frontline work, actually came up to the GLC What Works conference, which, I think that's, when you're putting on an academic conference and suddenly field practitioners start showing up, I think it shows that you're really on the right track.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work, and we'll look forward to seeing more from you in the future.
And thank you.
For more information about Ambassador C.deBaca, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.